Welcome to Faith Vocals. My name is Faith, back for another Bible study in the book of Genesis, but plans are a little bit different today. Today I have my dog Honor in the room with me. Usually there is family available to keep an eye on him and make sure he's doing all right, but today it's just me, so we've got a guest in the room. Usually he is sleeping in that corner over there. That's where he's lying right now, but he has been feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit attention needing today, so he may come and say hello to me in this corner over here. You may see his gray furry head poking up while we're in full screen. Or if you hear his collar jingling, if you hear him padding around, if you hear him scratching his bed, which is behind me, that is Honor saying hello. So that is going to be just to let you know in case you catch anything in the audio. But today we are going to, I tell you what, today is a relief to me. We've been going through some chapters, some passages in Genesis that don't generally get covered in children's Sunday school. And so while I'm familiar with the stories, I'm aware of what happens in them and just how depraved humanity can get. Even the ancestors of God's chosen people, the Israelites, it's a little bit difficult to discuss. All my years I've been raised on the Bible. At least my younger years I've been raised on the Bible children's Sunday school version, where the stories are meant for what children need to be learning rather than the complicated issues that adults need to deal with, such as what do you do when your family members are totally depraved. So and then last week, we had a little bit of a break there. We weren't talking about irate uncles or grudging brothers or murderous offspring. We were talking about the chain of losses that Jacob had experienced, Jacob/Israel. God confirmed in that passage that his name is Israel. We'll see him called Jacob throughout the book of Genesis anyway. I guess that's the name that the Israelites are familiar with him, familiar speaking of him with. Also, it's nice that he's called Jacob because it doesn't get us confused between the man Israel and the nation Israel. We had the account of how he lost several people in a row. His wife's nurse, Deborah, she would have been instrumental in the family. He lost his actual wife, the one that that was beloved to him, Rachel. She died in childbirth, and then he lost his father, Isaac. So that would have been a difficult time for him. We also went through the genealogy of Esau, aka Edom. He became the ancestor of the Edomites, as you might imagine. Got to see a couple of significant names. It seems to me like Esau tended to marry the daughters of influential people. I see my dog just over the chair there. There he is. Looks like he's decided to scratch his bed. So anyway, we see it seems like Esau married the daughters of influential people among the Canaanites. So that looked like a great thing for Esau, being able to marry into these influential families. Not so great for his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. The Bible says that his Canaanite wives pained the hearts of his parents because they were from a different culture, not a God-fearing culture. Jacob says that God was the fear of Isaac, and I've always kind of wondered that because God, we hear that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet to Isaac, apparently according to Jacob, he had a unique relationship with God. God was the fear of Isaac. We don't see that specifically in Isaac's story, but we see that Jacob mentions that God is the fear of Isaac. And I was kind of browsing around preparing for the study today. I wonder if that has anything to do with God calling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And of course, God stayed Abraham's hand at the last moment. Yep, there's Honor over there. Hello, boy. So that is the now I'm distracted. God called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He stayed Abraham's hand at the last moment. It was a test. God knows everything. I'm sure it was a test for Abraham, maybe for God to, in some way, to make a point to Abraham. This is why I had you wait so long for this son. I was developing your faith in me, and it has developed to the point where you trust me, even though I'm calling you to sacrifice your son. Later on in the Bible, it says that Abraham thought that perhaps God would raise Isaac from the dead after Abraham had obeyed God. Thankfully, Abraham didn't have to. God provided an alternate sacrifice. But that's a different story. We've already covered that. You can check back in the series if you like for that account, how I handled the story at that time. So now we are in the account of Jacob, and we are in one of the Sunday school lesson type accounts. This is starting to get into the story of Joseph. I think I hear my dog. Yep, he's right behind me here. So we have the story of Joseph now. This is starting to get into the last portion of the book of Genesis. So let's go ahead and pull up the Bible passage here. We've covered a lot of ground in Genesis, and I figure there's going to be a lot of backtracking as I'm trying to tie in some of the things that we've discovered and kind of get a fuller picture of this story that maybe if you've been in Sunday school, if you had experience with church, or if you've seen some popular movies. I think DreamWorks did a movie on Joseph. Maybe you've heard of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm not sure how. I've heard the title. I suspect it's not going to be accurate to the Bible story the way that that title is presented. But there have been cultural references to Joseph is what I'm referring to. So we're going to see how the Bible actually teaches about him. Let's go ahead and get started here. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. Now, I wanted to go ahead and pull up a map. Let me see here. Okay, so this is a really detailed map. We're going to be looking at this a little bit further. I'm just going to remind us some things about where Jacob has been. He used to be off in the northeast area, a city called Haran in the region of Padan Aram. The Bible calls Abraham a wandering Aramean because he came from the region of Padan Aram. And then when God called Jacob to come back home after he had been serving his uncle Laban for a while, it says that Jacob set his face toward Mount Gilead. So here's the region of Gilead. I'm guessing there was a mountain range in this area. So I'm sure if you're living in Israel, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you can clear that up for me. I'd love to see your comments. So we find that Jacob and Laban kind of face each other at a place that Jacob called Gilead. And they built a monument there to represent that this was the boundary. One would not cross the boundary against the other unprovoked. And Laban made Jacob promise things like, for instance, that Jacob would not take any wives other than Leah and Rachel. And so they kind of agreed to disagree at that point, largely because God spoke to Laban and said, don't you dare say anything either good or evil against Jacob. God had blessed Jacob, and so God warned Laban, and so Laban went home, much to his chagrin. The Bible tells us that then Jacob saw a camp of angels. This was a vision that he saw that reminded him that God was watching over him, was taking care of him, and he called that place Mahanaim because he set up a camp, and there was a camp of angels there. So there were two camps. And the name Mahanaim, that's actually how you pronounce it. I did it wrong the first time. Mahanaim means two camps. And then he was expecting to face his brother Esau. He was concerned about how that would go. That was around the area of Penuel. He was preparing his family, trying to divide everyone up. So if one group got killed, the others might escape. That if one group got killed, then people he cared about more might have a chance of escaping. And then he had this encounter with God. It's vague how the Bible writes it, but I do believe it was a encounter with God, because Jacob believed it was an encounter with God. He wrestled with a stranger, a man that he did not know. They got into this wrestling match. The man put out Jacob's hip joint, and said Jacob still wouldn't let go of the man until the man blessed him, and so that's where he got the name Israel. The man said that his name was Israel because he struggled with man and God. And Jacob called that place Penuel, which means face of God, because he saw the face of God and did not die there. He also moved on, set up some booths at Sukkoth, booths or tents. The word Sukkoth means booths. There is a festival in Israel. It's a divinely appointed festival named Sukkot. And during this festival, the Jewish people are supposed to build booths. And it's some people think that it's looking ahead, especially as Christians. Some of us think that it's looking ahead to when Jesus brings us home to the New Jerusalem to dwell with him. So that was a festival that God commanded the Jewish people to practice. Later on, and of course, this Camp Sukkoth has nothing to do with the festival. That the festival was established later, but there's a similar tie in the Hebrew language there. That's why the city has its name, is because Jacob camped there, set up booths there. And then he moved on to Shechem, and Shechem was a city, as we discovered. This was that story I was alluding to that was a little bit difficult to me. The prince of the city raped Jacob's daughter Dinah and kept her in his home because he wanted to marry her. He was willing to do just about anything to marry her, including convince the entire city that the men needed to be circumcised in order to be able to establish trade relations and marital relations with Jacob and his family. Jacob's two sons, Simeon and Levi, took advantage of this. It was a trick that they had established when everyone was weak, based on after the circumcision, when all the men in the city were weak. These two fellows went into the city and killed all the men, including the king of the city, including the prince, all of the men. And then their brothers came in and looted the city and took all of the women and children. So that, to me, is atrocious and horrible. And yet we see that God does forgive. God was blessing Jacob, who I believe was dedicated to serving God. Especially after that, of course, Jacob was concerned because all the surrounding peoples might come after them now, because they're clearly a threat. They destroyed an entire city by treason. What would they do to the other cities? So they would be seen as at the least criminals, at the most probably terrorists. So God told Jacob to go to Bethel, and the Bible says that as Jacob went to Bethel, the nations around were put in fear of Jacob and his family, so they did not attack Jacob and his family. Jacob rededicated himself to God. He had originally left Bethel, saying if God would take care of him, he would commit himself to God. And so God reminded him of that and brought him back to establish that commitment. And then Jacob traveled south to Bethlehem, and that is where his wife Rachel passed away, as we found out in the last video. And then he continued south to Hebron. That was where Abraham had originally called home. It was now where Isaac called home, and that was where Isaac passed away. So this is where Jacob would be living. And we find that Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. So that's where he is now. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. So if you hadn't seen our section on Jacob and his wives and how these wives interacted with one another, to quickly summarize that, when Jacob met Rachel, his uncle Laban's daughter, so his cousin, he fell in love with Rachel, but she was the second oldest daughter. Her older sister Leah apparently had weak eyes. I wonder if the Bible brings that up as an explanation for why Jacob may not have taken to her. It doesn't specifically tie the two together. It doesn't say why Jacob didn't take to Leah. It just says that he loved Rachel. He wanted to marry Rachel. He worked 7 years to marry Rachel, but then Laban pulled a switcheroo and tricked Jacob into marrying Leah instead. So Jacob finds himself married to Leah. He wanted to marry Rachel, and so he agrees to work another 7 years. He marries Rachel and then starts working off the 7 years that he promised the second time in order to marry her. In the meantime, God blessed Leah because Leah was basically unloved by Jacob. She wasn't the one he wanted, so she definitely felt the emptiness in their relationship. God blessed her with fertility. She was able to bear quite a number of children. She started off with 4, who are in order: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. So all of them have some significant accounts. We learned last time, unfortunately, Reuben fooled around with one of these ladies, with Bilhah, after he grew up, but he was the firstborn. Simeon and Levi, of course, were the troublemakers who put the men of Shechem to death. Judah, we're going to see a significant story about him next week, or next video. And then Leah ceased bearing children for a time. Rachel was barren in the beginning of the marriage, and so they had a custom in Canaan, maybe from the region of Haran, because that was where these ladies had come from. The custom, and also Abraham and his wife had practiced this custom too. We're going to see a little bit about that later on. We're going to review a little bit about that. But if the man's wife was not bearing children and there was a female servant in the home, then the wife might tell her husband, "You can have my servant as a concubine or as your wife, and will act as though the children she gives you are actually my children. Those will be children in my name." And so that was what Jacob did in this case. Rachel was not bearing children, and she said, "Have my servant Bilhah, and her children will be my sons." So that's what happened, and Bilhah had a couple sons. Let me go ahead and look up which sons these are, because these are the sons that Joseph is with in this account. So here we find where Rachel, in Genesis 30, where Rachel tells him, "Have sons by my servant Bilhah." And she conceived and bore Jacob a son, Dan, so he would be the 5th son. And then the 6th son was Naphtali. So Dan and Naphtali are a part of our account here because Joseph was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Because Leah had ceased bearing children, now Rachel was getting a couple children through her handmaid Bilhah. Leah was still not really loved by Jacob, and she thought maybe a couple more children, and he'll finally love me. So she gave Jacob her maidservant Zilpah, and Zilpah bore children to Jacob. We're going to scroll down here. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune has come," so she called his name Gad, and he was the 7th son. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. So we have Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So apparently Joseph was pasturing the flock, was shepherding with his brothers, specifically the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. So he was out with Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. So apparently they were doing something that they ought not to have been doing. We're not told what that report was. So all we know is that Joseph had a bad report for them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. So I wanted to kind of investigate really quick, how old might Jacob have been once how old might Israel have been once Joseph was born? So I looked back at this reference here. It tells us that Esau was 40 years old, and he took these women to be his wives, these Canaanite women who gave his parents heartache. So Esau and Jacob were twins. They were both born at the same time. So if Esau is 40 years old, Jacob was 40 years old. The next chapter over, we have the story where Jacob deceives his father Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing that Isaac intended for Esau. I'm going to come back to the chapter we left really quick and just summarize that story because we've been over it quite a number of times. Isaac was blind, and so he was easily deceived that Jacob was instead Esau. And so Esau was very angry with Jacob for taking this blessing. Jacob had already convinced Esau to bargain away his birthright, and now Jacob had taken away this blessing that was going to be specifically Esau's from Isaac. Isaac couldn't give another blessing because he'd basically given Jacob everything. He kind of gave Esau a half blessing, but not very satisfying. And so Esau was ready to kill Jacob for this deception. So that was why Jacob had to run north to Haran to live with his uncle Laban. Of course, Jacob worked for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. He worked another 7 years again in order to marry Rachel. And then finally, he said, "Let me work 7 years more for you, Laban, so that I can establish my household." And he made an agreement with Laban to shepherd Laban's flocks and to take the ones that were not pristinely white, the ones that might have been mottled or spotted or striped. And so those became Jacob's sheep, which are probably some of the sheep that Joseph and his brothers are shepherding, or at least those would be the progenitors of the sheep that Joseph and his brothers are shepherding. So Laban kept trying to change the deal because God was blessing Jacob with more sheep out of Laban's flocks. And so Jacob didn't work the full 7 years, which would have brought him to 21 years with Laban. He worked for 20 years. In that time, I think within the first 7 years he worked 7 years to get Rachel, and then in that second year, a period of 7 years, so up to the 14-year mark, that was when he was having his sons by his 4 wives, we'll say, his 2 wives and his 2 concubines. So toward the end of that second period of 7 years, towards the end of that 14 years would have been when Joseph was born. Joseph was the first son of Rachel, and we're told around that time that she had born Joseph. So let's say that Jacob was about 40 years old when he had to run away. Maybe he was a little older than that. We add on 14 years, so he would have been about 54 at least when Joseph was born, which I think is interesting because we find in the chapter before this chapter here, now we're in Genesis 37, in Genesis 36, we find that Isaac died when he was 180 years old. So 180, the midpoint for 180 years would be about 90 years old. You'd think that you wouldn't get old until maybe about 90 years old. And yet we're finding, according to this passage, that Joseph was the son of Israel's old age, Israel would have been between 54 and 60 years old, because he ran away from Laban after 20 years of service to Laban. So he had to have been between 54 and 60 years old when Joseph was born. Now Joseph is 17 years old, as we're finding. So we're going to say that, 54 plus 17 would be 60, 71. 71 we'll say, at the youngest that Jacob would have been. And so that kind of gives us a ballpark there. Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. What is this? Robe with long sleeves. So that's how some of the older ancient versions translate this passage. So apparently it's a little bit difficult to translate. Of course, traditionally we recognize the account of the robe with many colors. Either way, a robe with long sleeves would require more material. I would think a robe of many colors would be significant, because sometimes dyes were expensive back then. Dyes would have to be imported and would cost a good amount of money. I think the meaning here is that Joseph was significant, and this coat was a sign of Joseph's significance compared to the rest of his brothers, because Joseph was the first son of Israel, Jacob's most beloved wife Rachel, and she bore him in Jacob's old age. So clearly there is some favoritism here. Interestingly, Isaac, Jacob's father, also showed favoritism. Isaac favored Esau. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, favored Jacob. So there was some favoritism in Jacob's upbringing, and now he's bringing that into his bringing up of his own sons. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So I don't know if maybe you've had this experience with any of your siblings, where anything that they say to you is going to at least insinuate hostility, if not be overtly hostile. I remember with my brother and I was probably more likely to be like these brothers. I was the older sibling. Maybe that has something to do with it. But of course, that gave me some size advantage over my brother for a while, and then he had his growth spurt. But I had to learn to mature to come to respect him and love him as I ought to, and can definitely relate to being the immature mature child. Come to think of it, come to realize. So, but of course, these brothers, Joseph is 17. I guess all of these brothers would be probably within 7 years of his age, so up to 24 years of age for the oldest brother. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So maybe one might think Joseph would be wise to keep his mouth shut, but it's his dream. He can say what he wants, free speech. That wasn't a right known in the nation of Canaan, in the region of Canaan, but I like the principle of free speech. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it, and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So his brothers have no trouble interpreting this dream. They understand exactly what it means. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. Not sure I'm seeing the discernment here, but he said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." I wonder if he was kind of egging his brothers on. I wonder if he was kind of trolling them. I sure believe that he had the dreams, but you'd think he'd know better. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" So this probably would have been Leah, since Rachel had already passed away by this point. But his father doesn't have any trouble interpreting this dream either. And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind, which I guess would be significant also, because when Jacob was born, his mother Rebecca was having trouble in childbirth because she had twins, and she didn't realize this, and it was a terrible experience. Her pregnancy was terrible for her, so she inquired of God, why is this pregnancy so difficult? And God replied back to her that there were 2 nations in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. So Jacob was raised with that understanding. I'm sure that Rebecca would have made him aware of that. She was the one who instigated him to deceive Isaac to get the blessing that was meant for Esau, which actually did dictate which child was to be the prominent child. Isaac would have told Esau that he would have ruled over his brothers, his family, including Jacob. But since Jacob had deceived Isaac into giving him that blessing, Jacob got to rule over his family, including Esau, according to this. Now, Jacob never actually took a ruler position over Esau. Later on, as we found at the encounter at Peniel, where Jacob wrestled with God and gained the name Israel. Jacob was very humble in meeting his brother and very accommodating. He definitely was not claiming any superiority to Esau. So Jacob was being wise and was he had a tendency to be shrewd. That's what Jacob means. It carries the idea of shrewdness, and he was employing it with Esau. Better to make friends of the brother who wants to kill you than to insist on being the overlord. Something that Joseph apparently has not learned yet at the age of 17. So but Jacob's keeping this saying in mind. You know, Joseph is the youngest, the second youngest son. There was one son that Rachel bore later on named Benjamin, who would have been much younger than Joseph. And Joseph was now the, of these first 10 brothers, he would have been the youngest. So we got a spoiler here. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, which I think is interesting. Let's have another look at the map. This is a different map. We'll get to that one. So they were living down here in Hebron, kind of towards the southern end of the nation of Israel. And the 9 older brothers, I assume all 9 of them, decide that they're going to take the sheep all the way up here to Shechem. And that is actually the city, as I've mentioned, that they defeated. They killed all the men and took the women and children. So I don't expect there's a lot of people left in Shechem for them to deal with. Maybe that was why it was attractive to them. Not a lot of competition for the grazing lands. It just seems like an odd place to go, the place where you committed this atrocity to take the flocks back to. But anyway, they went to pasture the flock near Shechem. And Israel, Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So interestingly, Jacob did not send Joseph at first. I'm wondering if perhaps because Joseph was his precious son, if he got a privileged position to stay home, or if Jacob was protecting Joseph. You know what? You don't have to go, just in case there's anything wrong. I'd prefer you to stay here with me. But of course, he felt comfortable sending Joseph to see how things were when the brothers were gone for a while. So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. So here's Dothan. We have Shechem down here, and you go a little bit up here to Dothan. This is all in the region of the Hivites, apparently. So they went a little bit further north, a little further away from where Jacob was, and that's where Joseph found them. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Which, come to think of it, given that they've already put an entire city of men to death, that actually seems to be in character for them. Definitely, you don't think in a healthy, happy family that the siblings would decide it's okay to kill one another. Maybe you'd expect them to think about it if they're sibling rivalries. I imagine in a home of 12 young men, that it's going to seem cramped no matter how much space they've got. But definitely, it just doesn't seem conscionable to decide it's okay to kill your brother. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dream." So these pits might have been cisterns, apparently. So would have been a place where if it's raining, then the water would accumulate. If it's been dry, then there wouldn't be any water in the cistern. So they've got this decision. There's no one to see how they treat Joseph. They can concoct this lie: a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So Reuben's got this plan. Reuben actually seems pretty decent in this chapter, despite what we learned about him in the previous chapter. He at least has the sense to know you don't kill your brother. He also has the sense to know not to confront his brothers directly. So listen, let's not put the work into it. It's not necessary. We'll just let nature take its course. Just throw him in the pit first and let nature take its course. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him away and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. So we find out a little bit later that Reuben was apparently not with the group when they saw this. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. So let me go ahead and say something about the Ishmaelites. Ishmael was the first son of Abraham. Abraham had been promised by God when he was 75 years old that God would give him a son. God took his time about giving Abraham a son, and his wife Sarah said, "Listen, Abraham, it's clear the plan is not that I'm going to give you a son. So how about we take my servant Hagar, and she can give you a son, and I'll be the mother to that son. So yeah, why don't we do that? I know you've been faithful to me. I've been your only wife all this time, even though we've got these female servants in the house. You haven't taken any concubines, but go ahead and have a son by Hagar. It's okay." So that's what Abraham did. And Ishmael was the son of Abraham and Hagar. And when Hagar saw that she was pregnant and Sarah had never been pregnant, Hagar began to get a little haughty. She began to see herself as more important than her mistress, which didn't sit well with Sarah. Sarah began mistreating Hagar. which made Hagar run away while she was pregnant. God appeared to Hagar, sent an angel actually to appear to Hagar. It's possible that angel was what we Christians call a theophany, would have been God the Son appearing as a messenger, an angel, to someone on earth. So this angel told her, actually, you should go back to your mistress Sarah. Everything will be fine. So Hagar went back to Abraham. Her son Ishmael was born to Abraham, and was 14 years old when Isaac was born. And Abraham loved Ishmael, but definitely Isaac was the promised son. So Isaac was the preeminent son in Abraham's household. Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac, apparently. Kind of a little bit hard to know what the sense was that she observed Ishmael in, whether he was mocking, whether he was laughing, but she just didn't like that boy being in the same household with her son. This was her son, Isaac. And so she actually sent Hagar away, and God let Abraham know, okay, it's fine. Hagar will be fine. I'm going to bless Ishmael just like I'm going to bless Isaac, that he will become a great nation. For your sake, I'm going to bless Ishmael. So Ishmael then moved away. After Sarah passed away, Abraham had another wife named Keturah, and she had children. One of them was the name Midian. So let's go down a little bit further. Judah says, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. We can sell him, but why do we have to kill him? And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. So here's the question. Did Joseph get sold to the Ishmaelites or to the Midianites? Ishmael, we know, was a son of Abraham. I've seen, as I was browsing around, I saw that there's a suggestion that the Ishmaelites were the Midianites, and I would say no, that can't be, because Abraham had Ishmael. Ishmael would have been a half-brother to Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob. So Ishmael now would be like a half-uncle to Jacob. And then we're talking about Jacob's sons now, who are dealing with the offspring of Ishmael, maybe his sons or his grandsons, and probably his sons. So these are like their cousins that they're dealing with. The Midianites, Midian was also a son of Abraham. So these are cousins on a different side. They're not from the side of Ishmael's family. They've got their own side, the Midianite side of Abraham's line. But I was looking around for where the Ishmaelites and where the Midianites lived. Interestingly, we see that they came from Gilead. So like I showed on this map earlier, Gilead would have been over around in this area. But that is not where I was seeing the Ishmaelites and the Midianites originating. So I saw a couple maps based on this passage here. This is about Ishmael. No, actually, this one here. Let me check. This one here. There we go. So Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. This is where she bore him Midian. We'll go a little bit further down to the generations of Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. And we're told that Ishmael's offspring settled from Havilah to Shur. So I looked at a couple maps. There are a couple different locations that I saw for Havilah. And I don't know what the motivations for the people who drew up these maps would have been. I think there is a possible reason for people to interpret the location of Havilah based on their own religious beliefs. Not to say that any one position is necessarily wrong. Obviously, there would be one Havilah that we're talking about, and I saw a couple of them, so one of them's got to be wrong. So I don't I'm not an expert in ancient geography. I don't want to make my own decision about where Havilah was, but I'll show you what I saw. I'm using Google Maps because it's the easiest way for me to kind of delineate both of the options. So here's the nation of Israel, and here is the Red Sea. This is one of the branches of the Red Sea, and this is Saudi Arabia over here. So what I was seeing when this here, the Sinai Peninsula, the region, the wilderness of Shur, from what I was seeing in the maps, is around in here. So this is where Ishmael would have been settling, and then he would have his offspring would have also settled from here to Havilah. So where's Havilah? I saw one map that put Havilah over here towards Kuwait. I saw another map that put Havilah down here in Yemen. So Ishmael's descendants would have either extended from west to east, or they would have extended from north to southeast. That's what I was seeing. But what I thought was interesting is that the people of Midian kind of lived in this region along the ear of the Red Sea. And the maps that I was seeing, at least, I don't know if there's any that show any discrepancy, but the maps that I was seeing seemed consistent, putting Midian right here. So whether Ishmael extended across or whether Ishmael extended downward, they kind of seem like they would have overlapped or been neighbors with the Midianites. So I'm thinking what happened here, this is just my speculation, was that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites apparently teamed up for this caravan, which was, we'll go to this map, they would have been trading down south of this map here, and they wanted to go all the way up north to Gilead. So in order to be safe during their travels, they would have established a caravan, probably decided, hey, we're friendly with one another, we can work together to sell our wares. And then they would have traveled, here's the wilderness of Shur. So around in this area, they got together and traveled up to Gilead. And then they're on the way back when these brothers, these sons of Jacob, encounter them. Coming from Gilead on their way to carry it down to Egypt. So they apparently had a trading route. They would have gone from Gilead down here through Shur. The other side of Shur would be Egypt, and they would have been able to make trade there. So apparently they were just fine with also buying a slave to trade off to Egypt. The Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Later on in the Bible, we find that the common price for a slave is 30 shekels. So what is this footnote? Okay, it's telling us what the weight of the metal would be. So usually, it seems to me across Israel's history, usually the common price for a slave was 30 shekels of silver. So I'm getting the feeling that these brothers are giving the Midianites a deal. We just want him off of our hands. We're tired of him. And so you're not going to kill him because he's your brother, but you're going to sell him for less than he's worth. Tell you what, there is no price you can put on a human life. So any price would be less than they're worth. But long and short of it, they took Joseph down to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit, so see, he was away, he was not part of this deal, and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? What am I going to do? He had been planning to rescue Joseph. What am I going to do? Now I'm bound up with you guys in this murder plot. And then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, But he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son." Sheol was the word that they meant for the grave, for whatever came after death. "To my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So we see that Israel, Jacob, is going to carry his mourning for Joseph to the end of his life as things stand. And hopefully that taught his sons a lesson in the long run. We'll see how things go for them, but definitely after what happened at Shechem, after this escapade, I would personally like to see consequences for their kind of wild behavior. We'll go ahead and wrap up the story here because the next chapter gets into an account of Judah. It doesn't really have anything to do with Joseph, so this seems like a natural wrapping up point. And I'll switch to the full cam here. So I wanted to say the Bible is very honest about the nature of humans, including the nature of God's chosen people, the Israelites. These sons of Jacob definitely do not seem like admirable people. And so it's a little bit uncomfortable for me as someone who believes what the Bible says, that the nation of Israel is God's chosen people, that they have a special place in God's plan. It's a little bit uncomfortable for me to talk about all the times that Israel failed, and the Bible is very honest about all of Israel's failings. Israel, the man himself, was the man who struggled with God, and then his own offspring, he had issues taking care of his offspring. So it appears he was not able to raise them to follow the Lord as his father Isaac had raised him to follow the Lord, as Abraham had raised Isaac to follow the Lord. And I've gotten to meet people, senior citizens who have children, who their parents have tried to raise their children to love and serve the Lord, and yet those children in their adulthood turned away and decided that that wasn't for them. And it's a burden on the parents' hearts because the parents are doing their best to raise the children to serve the Lord. And of course, everyone's an individual. Everyone gets to make up their own minds. And it's I've heard discussions between one family and another where someone who hasn't had the same issues raising their children blames the first parent for being ineffective at raising their children to serve the Lord. And I looking at a situation like that, I mean, look at Jacob. He rededicated his life to God. He was devoted to God, told his family to put away their idols. They were going to be devoted to God, but he was not able to cause his sons to live godly lives. That was their own decision. And that just reminds me there are people out there who say, well, my parents were Christians, so I'm a Christian by proxy. I'm a Christian because I was raised in a Christian family. And that is not how this works. Everybody's an individual. Everybody makes their own decision. And so it is up to every individual, no matter what family they come from, to be familiar with why it is that there is a Christian faith to begin with. And the Bible teaches us that man is at enmity with God. Every single human being has rebelled against God, has disobeyed God. And so that the standard that is, we've fallen short of God's glory, we've fallen short of perfection, and because we have rebelled against this infinite, sovereign, innocent being, our own crime is infinite. And so that rebellion is worth an infinite penalty, which is known in the Bible as the lake of fire, also called hell, a place of eternal torment. And that is where we get the repercussions for turning away from God, who is the source of all life and all goodness. What else can you expect when you reject that kind of being? But God loved us so much, the Bible says, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in his Son, Jesus Christ, will be saved. The way that works is that Jesus, God's Son, came to earth, lived a perfect life, did not sin at all, and yet he died a criminal's death. The Bible says he laid down his life. No one took it from him. He died a criminal's death because he was standing as our advocate between us and God, standing as a substitution between us and God. He took on all of the punishment that we deserved. And now, and also, he took that punishment. He died the criminal's death. And also 3 days later, he rose from the dead, which tells us that God the Father approved of the death of God the Son on behalf of humankind. Not only he died, he rose again. And now he is, the Bible tells us, he is in heaven interceding for those who choose to accept that sacrifice for ourselves. We can't do anything that is capable of saving us from our sins. We can't wash the records clean by any deeds we do. The only thing we can do is to rely on the perfection that Jesus had and that Jesus offers us. And so the my brain is wandering. This is a very important message, and so I do believe that there would be a spiritual enemy to God, Satan, who may not want the message to be brought up. So I don't know if that's what's going on here, or if it's just me, if I'm just being absent-minded. But we'll get back on track. So Jesus, the only recourse we have, since we cannot work ourselves clean, is to trust that through Jesus, through the righteousness that Jesus provides for us through his sacrifice, if we accept that for ourselves, if we're humble and say, God, I know you've got a plan, and I am not going to try to make my own plan. I'm going to accept your plan. Then that righteousness is ours. Jesus grants that righteousness to us. We become right with God, and then we have the benefits of that relationship with God. One of which is we're promised an eternal life with God in heaven, not eternal torment, but eternal blessing in a relationship that we're supposed to have with God. So that's that I lose track of how it is that I tied into that message from talking about Jacob's sons. Jacob's sons certainly had their own sins. Again, no one is perfect. We all fall short of the glory of God. Definitely, Jacob's sons were made their own individual choices. That is where we are. Made their own individual choices. Jacob could not make them live according to God's will, and God is honest about that in the Bible. God is also honest about the good choices that they made, such as Reuben, saying that he wanted to save Joseph instead of killing him, even though Reuben apparently was one of the brothers that hated Joseph also. He knew better than to have Joseph killed. We're going to see good choices made down the line in the future by these sons. And then it's because of these sons, particularly because of Judah, by the way, that you and I have redemption for our sins if we choose to accept it from God. Because Judah, it turns out, is the ancestor of Jesus Christ. Later on, Jesus Christ, God the Son, entered humanity through Mary, who was a descendant of Jesus Christ. So I'll wrap it up there, and we'll call it a night. God bless you.